Hello, people. So let's say that you're a web developer, or you're interested in becoming a web developer, and you don't know where to start. A lot of people would recommend that you start off learning HTML and CSS, and I think that's important, but it's not quite where I would start. Um, I think it's important for you to understand this question. So when you open up a web browser, and you type in google.com, um, you see the web page. But how does that happen? So that's the question that I want to talk about in this video, and I think it's important to have some sort of high-level understanding of that before you even touch HTML. And hopefully you'll get that in watching this video. So, okay. How does this happen? Given that you don't know the answer, I'm sure you have, some sort of theories and hypotheses of how it works. So one possibility is that this is your computer, this is your web browser, and Google sort of sits inside of here. So when you go to google.com, Google's already in here, and it just sort of loads it. And this is not what happens. So another possibility of what you think might happen is that we've got, this is your computer, this is your web browser, and Google sort of sits over here, where it's outside of your web browser, but it's still in your computer. So when you go to google.com, you sort of send a request to here, and it responds, and then Google is loaded. And this also isn't what happened. Isn't how it works. So think about, like, imagine that this was how it works. Like, what would the implications of that mean? So if you want this web browser to access the whole internet, like be able to see every website that's out there, that would mean that every website would have to be loaded in here, like every single one. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to access it. And there are a lot of websites. There's probably millions of websites, and that would take up a lot of memory in your computer. So that's one downside to this architecture. Another downside is that what happens when one of these websites updates? You'd have to constantly be going to each one of these apps, is essentially what they are, and checking for updates and updating them. And yeah, this is basically how apps work. And I don't have a good enough understanding of why apps work the way they do, but I definitely see the downsides. And this all isn't really so important right now. I'm just trying to get you to think about the possibilities and what the downsides of the possibilities are. Okay, so yeah, these two possibilities, where Google's in your browser and Google's in your computer, aren't how it works. So that, if I'm not mistaken, leaves only the logical possibility that here's your computer. Whoops. Here's your browser. And Google lives outside of both of these things. That's logically all that's left, I think. And this is how it works. Google is not inside your computer or your browser. And also Google isn't like just in thin air, it's also inside its own computer. And yeah, what happens is a request is made to Google, and it responds with some stuff, and then the web page is loaded. And this is how the internet works. Yeah, one thing to note is that it's actually not this simple. I'll give two quick qualifiers. First of all, it's not usually the case where you've got one computer talking to another one. Oh, I'm sorry, like a one-to-one thing where one computer talks directly to another one. In reality, there's a lot of intermediates where this guy goes to this guy, goes to this guy, goes to this guy. Yeah, and that's how it works in real life. The second thing to note is that there's this thing called caching, where a lot of the times you actually will store a little Google inside here, and rather than going out to the real Google, it'll just load this guy. But that's not worth getting into here. Let me quickly talk about what a server is. So, imagine like you go to Chipotle and you make a request for a burrito, and you know a server responds to your request with a burrito. Like the burrito is the response. This is really how the internet works, where you've got two parties. The requester, the client is what the requester is called. I guess you're a client when you go to Chipotle. And the server, a server is a computer in this context, but in Chipotle it's the same thing. You've got a server. And in the Chipotle context, the client requests something and the server responds with what the client wanted. And that's exactly how it works in the world of the internet. This is the client, this is the server. Client makes a request, the server responds. Okay, so now let me, I want to compare and contrast two different applications. So here we were talking about, this is the Chrome application, but I want to compare Chrome to this thing called Postman. So that's a little bit big, but whatever. So here we've got another computer, and inside of the computer is the application called Postman. So the question I want to ask is, like, what happens when Postman sends the same request as this guy to Google, and Google responds with the same stuff? That's part of the way the internet works. One request, the same request gets the same response all the time. So you've got the same request. I'm telling you, these are both going to send the same request, and the same response is going to come through. So let's look at what happens. We already know what happens here. When you send the request to google.com, the result is that you see this web page. But let's open up this thing called Postman, this application. And let's make the same request. So I'm just going to copy and paste this here so you know it's the same exact request. We send it, and we get this response. So this might be a little confusing. Like I said that these two requests, this request and this request, are the same. And I told you that the responses are also the same. But they look pretty different, right? Like this loaded a picture of the website, and this responded with this random stuff. So yeah, did I lie to you? Like, how is this happening? And the answer is that no, I didn't lie to you. And let me show you. So let me open this up. Okay, so this is showing the request that was made, a GET request to this URL. And now let's look here. It's a GET request to this URL. So the requests are the same. And now let's look at the response. This response right here is the same as this response. So what's the difference between these two applications? So let me show you. So we've got this application called Google. Whoops. Well, I mean Chrome. And we've got this other application called Postman. And we get an input and an output. And here, input, output. So we're asking the question, that yeah, the input is well, so we're gonna look at, okay, the response part. So I'm treating this line here as the input, and this line here is the input. So they're both getting this same input, which is this here, this HTML, and this here, this HTML. So the input is going to be HTML. And it's the same HTML. But what is the output going to be? Well, with Chrome, we saw the output is this web page. It's a web page. But with Postman, actually the output is the same as the input, really. You can imagine it like this. With Postman, well, going back to here, Postman just shows, you know, this is the input. It just shows it, it just spits it right back at you. And that's the point of Postman, is so you can see what the response actually is. Okay, so this is a good segue into HTML. So yeah, people say that you should learn HTML. Well, what does that really mean? I like to think of it like this, where there's a certain output that you're interested. Like, let's say I'm interested in the output of "Hi, I'm Adam," and the job of a web developer is to figure out what input will produce that output. They're the one writing the HTML, so they have to know what HTML is going to produce this output, and that's really what it means to learn HTML. So the answer to this question I'll show you is this. Oops. Hi, I'm Adam, in this, what's called a p tag. And let's do this. So let's say we want this. How would we get it to look like that? Well, this isn't going to produce the bolded version, it's going to produce the regular version. And yeah, this is the job of someone who knows HTML. And I'll show you the answer to this question is this. Yeah, and I'm going to stop here because this video isn't about teaching you HTML. It's really about giving you the context before you go to learn HTML. So hopefully you understand that a little bit better and are ready to go learn some HTML.